Welcome to Sproutcast, where we speak with changemakers, social innovators, and entrepreneurs about how to make the world a better place. And now, here's your host, Julia Duffy.
Welcome to Sproutcast. My name is Julia Duffy, and today we're speaking with Rhys Williams of West Australian organisation The Makers. Rhys has had a varied career in the non-profit sector, leading a number of organisations, as well as serving on several boards. He currently serves on the board of the Mandurah Performing Arts Centre, Regional Development Australia Peel, and Small Business Centre Peel. He's also an ambassador of One Young World. Welcome to Sproutcast, Rhys.
Thanks for having me.
I thought I'd start by asking you, Rhys, how your relationship with the NFP space kind of arose. Were you always interested in being involved in NFPs? And kind of when did this involvement begin?
It happened completely by accident. I was in high school and I was involved. I didn't even know what a not-for-profit was, but I was volunteering for a local health promotion project with some mates.
Okay, wonderful.
And it kind of grew from there.
I think that's probably a similar story for a lot of people, that it begins with volunteering or perhaps fundraising drives at school. And so what was perhaps your more serious involvement with an organisation beyond just that volunteering stage?
Yeah, so for me it was kind of an interesting progression where I was volunteering for this local project, as I mentioned, a health promotion project called the Youth on Health Festival, which was about working with high schools in my local area to help teenagers use the arts as a way of learning about the important health issues that they were faced with. And so I started that when I was about 13, and then when I turned 17, the coordinator of that project had fallen ill and decided that she was going to wind it up. And so I was invited, to sort of consider whether or not I'd be interested in taking on the project. From there, I started a non-profit organisation to take over the running of this project, and kind of at the same time began to identify that there was scope to actually start looking at other youth-related projects, all in the interest of helping young people build their own capacity. And that was really how it kind of began. And it was interesting, at the time I didn't know about boards. I didn't know about balance sheets or profit and loss statements. But, myself and the other people that were kind of involved in kicking it off really were just keen to see this project continue, and that's sort of where it began. So, I mean, it was kind of a backwards journey, but in some ways it was better to happen that way, because it really meant that we were kind of able to learn as we go and, make the normal mistakes, but also, I guess, bring that young energy to it, I guess.
So you kind of, it sounds like, started with the starting your own organisation side of things really quite early on, rather than being involved at a kind of lower organisation level. So why is it that, you said out of necessity you started your own organisation. Could you maybe tell me a little bit more about that and a little bit more about this first organisation?
Yeah, so I think for us, we were running this youth health project in high schools in our local area, and we were doing this in conjunction with the local Lions Club, which was so great because we were able to really learn about the value of governance, as well as the importance of having this sort of fun, funky project. But there came a time in the project's progression where, as I said, the person that was running it had decided that it was probably time to wind it up. And, there was this void. How do we continue on with this project that we all loved and that we all had this passion for? And so it was out of that we kind of thought, okay, well, let's start a non-profit organisation. Let's kind of kick it off from here. And as I said, that sort of opened up other doors and really, for myself, opened my eyes up to the value of non-for-profits and the contribution that the organisations that are structured that way can contribute to the community and society as a whole. So that's sort of where it really came from. And we really diversified from there. And now, the non-profit that I run now is, I guess, we like to think of it as sort of a more mature version of that initial organisation that we set up. But interestingly, still one of our projects is that health promotion project that I was involved in when I was 13.
Okay, wonderful. So it's still kind of a part of the greater whole of the new organisation.
Yeah. And that's the great thing about nonprofits is that, when you don't have, the restraints of being fixed to a government service or having to deliver outcomes for your shareholders, you can be really driven by the passions of the people involved and also what the needs are of the people that you're there to serve. And, we've kind of grown with that, and it's just great. It's such a fun space to be in.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's interesting that point you made about the needs of the community. I'm just interested in, from the perspective of other people who might be thinking of starting their own organisation, how do you gauge what the needs of the community are and whether you're filling those properly, or perhaps there are other organisations that you could contribute to or work with, or whether there does need to be a specific organisation addressing this perhaps need gap?
Sure. So I think that's a really important point, because I think one of the things that can happen, and you see it happen probably too often, is people say, well, I have this idea, I'm going to start a charity, and off I go. And it kind of dilutes the resources because you have, lots of different small organisations trying to fight for the same amount of resources to fulfil the same service. So I think it's really important that people don't kind of just jump in, but actually have a look and say, well, is it about starting something new, or is it about contributing to something that someone else is doing, or whatever it might be. But I think in terms of identifying the need, I mean, I'd love to say that it was, as easy as going out and sort of collecting data and determining, this is the gap, this is how we need to sort of go about filling it. But I actually think it's more organic than that. I think it's usually based around the fact that passionate people will draw passionate people together. And, there's sort of this meeting of the minds that you see happen all in communities all over the place. And it's out of that connection and out of that kind of coming together that things, seem, all the best things seem to sort of come out of. So I think, that's the really exciting thing about the sort of the social enterprise. And I guess when I talk about nonprofits, I'm not talking about your large government provision nonprofits. I'm really talking about that social enterprise level. That's the exciting thing about it, is that it's really driven from the bottom up, and it's driven out of an organic need. And you know what? It'll fulfill the service that will fulfill the role that it needs to fulfill until it's done. And then, it'll evolve into something else. So it's an incredibly dynamic kind of part of the world, I think.
Yeah, that's definitely an interesting point to make about I guess, the organisation pursuing a particular mission or fulfilling a certain need and then maybe evolving into something else when times change. It's something that's very interesting to watch organisations doing that, and interesting to hear that that's something that you've got in mind, and that's something that you're keeping an eye on, I guess. And so is that perhaps something that you've thought of in the different changes that you've had throughout your career and the different organisations you've been involved in?
Well, I certainly think it's important and possible, I guess, at that grassroots level to be able to be adaptive and flexible. But I think it's also really important to know and to be really clear within that adaptability what your key purpose is. So, I think the last thing that we sort of need as a society is people saying, well, I'm going to start an organisation and I'm going to be whatever the world needs me to be. Because what tends to happen then, I guess, from what we've all noticed, I think, is that organisations will run around and try and find $1 here or $1 there and deliver this and deliver that for the object of just existing. So I think, adaptability and flexibility are really important, and it does make it exciting, and it does mean that you can respond to that community need. But I think it has to be done within the realms of the purpose you set out to achieve in the first place, or really the problem that you anticipated that you'd be solving. And I think that's really what it's about. Social enterprise should be about solving problems. And as long as you're kind of still looking at sort of solving a similar group of problems, then, for sure, that adaptability is a real kind of asset.
So I guess you were talking about before the early stages of setting up both of these organisations we've been discussing and getting together with other passionate people. Could you maybe discuss in a little more detail the process of going from a great idea and finding those passionate people to perhaps the more formal stages of launching the organisation, and because I understand that's kind of a process that you're in with the makers at the moment. Is that true?
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting example. I've sort of explained it. The Makers has grown out of, an evolution of an organisation that began with a project we thought was a good idea and has kind of evolved from there. And now we're at that stage with the Makers where, really we reflected on the model, or I guess on the way that we've gone about kind of working out what it is that we're going to do next in the space of social innovation and, community transformation, and identified that actually that model in itself is something worth grabbing onto. And so what we've aimed to do is we've aimed to go about setting up an organisation that is about empowering people to be makers themselves in their own communities and work out what sort of social innovation they might need to be able to solve some of the problems that they face locally. Often we rely on they to do something about it, and they like government or whatever it might be. But I actually think in this kind of changing world, there's a great opportunity for, the sort of collective we to do something about it. And so we're kind of looking at that and trying to work out how you really empower and enable communities to take responsibility for their own problem solving. So once we sort of realised that that's what we wanted to do, then it was about, setting up the formal structure, working out what sort of organisation we needed to be in terms of, charitable status and that sort of thing. Appointing a board, I think, is a really important part of it. And, the thing about social enterprise, the thing about small social enterprise is it doesn't work the same way as large organisations in that you have an established board. You actually have to go out and find board members, and you have to find the right board members that are going to fit the culture of your organisation. So I think that's a really important part, and something that we've kind of fortunately been able to attract a really great group of people to be involved in that. And then I guess it's about making sure that the brand is a good one, making sure that you have a business model that is going to be sustainable. Interesting though, I don't necessarily think it's about having that great 5-year strategic plan. I actually think you don't need to know what step 3 looks like. I think step 1 and 2 are enough, because part of that flexibility and that adaptability is being able to say, well, let's do the next, let's focus on starting really, really well. And then as long as we know what our end game is in terms of the vision that we want to achieve, the pathway will become more clear as we go. And that's a risk for sure. But I think that's sort of becoming more and more of a thing, is not being afraid to kind of jump in and just get started.
Do you mean particularly for smaller organisations then?
Absolutely. Look, again, you wouldn't say, look, like another organisation that I chair, the Mandurah Performing Arts Centre. I mean, that's quite a large organisation, and you wouldn't want to just be kind of figuring it out as you go. But I think one of the things that makes social enterprise unique, and especially small organisations, is that you can actually do that. You can actually take a risk, and I don't think it's reckless. I think it's the best way to achieve really dynamic outcomes. So certainly, I think it's a long way from in terms of taking the idea and turning it into a reality. That's the difficult part. It's actually easy to come up with the innovation, or not easy, but easier to come up with the innovation. But surrounding yourself around the right people, having a good plan of, at least in the short term, how you're going to kind of get up and running, and having a business model that is going to ensure your kind of sustainability, I think, are probably the 3 really important components.
And so these things that you mentioned just then about getting some of those things locked in, these practical elements, was that something that you sought a lot of advice about in the process of starting the organisation, and about the technical side of things? Just from the perspective of someone who's thinking of starting their own organisation, did you perhaps have any advice or insights about where to seek this type of advice, and also how useful this type of advice is? Yeah,
I actually think it's crucial, because I guess there's the 2 different parts of this. I spoke before about kind of the innovation and the not necessarily having to have the whole plan. Well, I think on one, that's definitely true on the side of the actual innovation itself, on the side of the project or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. But I think in order to be a successful organisation, you have to have a great idea with a great vision and flexibility and an ability to be able to draw in passionate people. But you also have to have strong governance and a structure that can withhold the kind of responsibility that you do hold as a company, because even though you're a non-profit, you're still a company. For me, I think I'd like to say that it was always that it was always easy. I think the first time that we did it, back in 2006, it must have been. There was no way that we did it all right, and we made plenty of mistakes. And fortunately, we had surrounded ourselves around really great mentors who were able to kind of point us in the right direction. I think out of that, we've learned lessons along the way, and so in setting up the makers, we kind of had a good feel for where we needed to be and how we needed to go about it. But what I would say to people interested in getting started is come up with the idea, know what the idea is and what you're intending to achieve. Don't be intimidated by the fact that you then have to go up and set up this structure and this kind of, have an accounting system and all of those things, because even though they're essential, there's plenty of people out there who, given the opportunity to be involved in supporting a great idea, will want to help. And so I would say, those mentors, those people that can give you advice and guidance are a really crucial part of it, because often, as a young CEO running a nonprofit, I certainly don't have any formal training in accounting, but I have a pretty good understanding that if I didn't do it well, and if my organisation didn't do it well, then we'd be in a bit of trouble. So it's about pulling in that capacity. So I would say that that's what it is just like get the right people on board, and they're out there, and people will sign up to great things because we all love being involved in great things.
And so you spoke a bit about mentors just then. How have you gone about seeking mentors? Is it people who you already had a connection with or had some involvement in organisations with, or a little bit more outside the box?
I think that's a really crucial question, and I think that will be different for everybody. For me, it's been varied. So some of my mentors have been people that I've worked with. I was on the City of Mandurah Council, and the mayor at the time was just this outstanding kind of community leader here in the community that I live in, and she gave me some incredible, and still to this day gives me some incredible mentoring and advice, whenever I kind of need it. And so sometimes it'll be people that that you work with, that you'll build that sort of close connection with. Other times it'll be asking. Other times for me it's been identifying that I might need some advice or some support in a particular area, and then it's like finding somebody through your networks or somebody that you don't know and writing them a letter and saying, hey, do you mind meeting me for coffee a few times over the next few months to give me some advice? I guess then there's the mentors that you never need to meet, the mentors that the books that you read written by people who have done great things or whatever. So I think mentors come in really various forms, but what I would absolutely say is I couldn't put a big enough value on the value of the mentors that I've had. I think the contribution that they've made to the success of our organisation and the success of so many organisations that I've come across is a really crucial part of the puzzle. And so I think that's twofold. I think one is, if you've got a need for some extra support or you just need some answers to some questions, go out and ask people, find mentors, and people will want to be involved. And I think then the other side of it is, if you've got the capacity, be a mentor yourself. If you've got the ability to be able to, if you've got skills and knowledge and wisdom, and you don't have to be, by the way, you don't have to be 70 years old to be a mentor. Anybody can be a mentor. If you've got that capacity, then do it, because that's kind of the way that it works. That's how we make sure that things continue to keep ticking over, because, we all kind of have to recognise that we have something to contribute and not be apologetic for that.
I might just step back a bit to something you were speaking about earlier. It's your attitude to strategy in your organisation. And I was just kind of wondering how you think that relates to funding in non-profit organisations, and how to kind of, I guess, balance the wanting to be adaptable and flexible, but also needing at least some security for your organisation, and how to kind of tie in the different perhaps funding streams you have, or just ensuring that you have security.
Look, I definitely think that there has to be a balance there. So in an ideal world, I would say what should happen is that innovators and entrepreneurs, and social entrepreneurs in particular, should be able to come up with an idea, collect some evidence over a pilot to be able to demonstrate that that idea has legs, and then we attract investment into those projects because that's what we need at the time. I'm not necessarily sure that we're there yet in Australia. I think that there's some countries that are there, and there's some interesting work that people can look at coming out of places like Finland, where that empowering those non-profit organisations to innovate is actually kind of leading the world. But I think that's okay that we're not there now in Australia. I think what we need to kind of be aware of is, as young innovators, maybe that's where we should be aiming to get to. But in the meantime, there's two parts to it, I would say. The first one is, you have to have a plan, and you have to have a plan that clearly shows a funding organisation, whether that be a corporate or a government agency, that you have the credibility, that your idea has the capacity to deliver, and that it's not going to all fall apart. So I think that's really important. And it's not about being reckless. So it is actually about saying, notwithstanding the fact that this might look a little bit different when we get to the end as it does today, we still have the ability to be able to pull this off, and we're highly capable. So I think that's really important. And then the other thing that I would say is we actually have to, and I think this is beginning to happen, which I would say is really exciting. We have to look at alternative options, because really probably in the next phase of Australia's kind of, relationship between government and non-profit, there's not going to be a huge amount of spare cash lying around to innovate. We're actually moving into a time where, unless we can clearly demonstrate that we can provide a service that government is comfortable with, it may be that there's going to be a challenge getting those funds. Now, we could either take that as, well, we'll only provide things that government's comfortable with. But I think there's a risk there, because I think if you stop innovating and you stop looking for new ways to solve challenges, you can kind of come into a bit of a longer term kind of struggle. So I think the other thing that we need to do is look at philanthropy, and I think that's beginning to really take shape. I think things like the giving circles, Impact 100s, and the idea of bringing philanthropy to a citizen's level and not necessarily having to rely on the super rich is a really exciting trend. And I think that's where the innovation is going to come from in the next decade. I think it's going to be, innovators taking ideas to potential investors on the ground, citizen philanthropists who can say, collectively, we're going to give you 10 grand and help you to get this pilot off the ground. And once you've shown us that it works, we will give you the 100 that you need. So I think that's probably, there's a couple of things in that, but I think, we're looking at providing services to government that they're comfortable with, being able to demonstrate our credibility. And then if we're really keen on innovating, looking at how we can sort of support that from the bottom up.
You mentioned the situation in Finland with startup organisations there, or with innovation. Is that something you could speak on further? It's something I'd be interested to hear more about. I don't think that that's something that we're very aware of here necessarily. So
I think one of the things that's happening in other countries that's really interesting is this idea of being comfortable with supporting innovation. And what does that kind of mean? I think what it means is that, innovation has kind of this rebellious streak about it. It's like being able to challenge the rules sometimes, challenge the status quo, and do it a bit differently. And so that's a risk for government, I think. And it's a risk for corporates too, because if you were investing in something or you're supporting a project that may fail, is that going to reflect badly on your corporate social responsibility or your sort of use of taxpayers' money? But I think some countries, and I think Finland is a good example of one, and other Scandinavian countries and countries that are kind of winning that battle, there seems to be a more accepted approach to failure. In fact, I heard one young social entrepreneur who was speaking at a conference I was at last week talk about failure as a badge of honor in his country. And he spoke about the fact that, you break the rules, and, in breaking the rules, essentially what you're doing is saying, and when I say break the rules, I mean, not big rules, but I mean, like, okay, if you challenge the status quo and you do it differently, the response to that, if it works, is great, and the response to that is, if it doesn't work, is great. And I think that's a paradigm shift that we perhaps need to as young startup entrepreneurs who are going to be listening to this and going to be involved in the summit, that's one of the things that we really need to think about, is how do we begin to position ourselves as we gain influence and credibility as a sector, to make sure that people understand that failure is okay, that these cheap wins or cheap failures are fine, and that really that's kind of where innovation comes from. That we actually have to push the boundary. And how does that relate to nonprofits? Well, I think nonprofit is a really good place to innovate, because you can still have market driven forces, but it's a little less risky. And it's also, a great place to sort of play, which is really what innovation is about. It's kind of just getting together and playing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think perhaps now might be a great point to move on to speaking about the role of the board in non-profit organisations, and to perhaps your involvement in a few boards. So perhaps if you could just outline some of the board positions you held and have held, and ones that you're currently serving on. What was your first board position?
Sure. So I remember, having been involved in setting up a nonprofit, and I guess trying to run one. I should have had a bit of an idea of what a board looked like, but probably the answer is I didn't really. And so I was asked to sit on a board as I think the token young person. I was 18, and I think that's kind of what happens when you're 18. And so it was the Peel Youth Services, Peel being the name of the region that I live in, south of Perth, and Peel Regional Youth Services it was. And it was a great organisation doing some really awesome stuff in the local region around homelessness for young people and, development programs for at-risk kids. And it was a total eye-opener to be sitting at a table with board members, talking about, strategy and governance and all of those things. But I have to say, I studied commerce at Curtin Uni, and I think I probably got more out of being a board member in terms of understanding of the way that business operates, because nonprofit is still business, and I think people don't remember that enough, than I have probably in my years of studying commerce together. So moving on from that first organisation, involved in some other youth organisations, which was great, and then kind of at 21 was elected to the City of Mandurah Council, which is kind of, I guess, a big board, and that was a fascinating role, chairing the community planning and economic development committee, which was the first board I'd ever chaired, and dealing with interesting conversations with residents who were unhappy with the cracks in their footpaths, but also being, I guess, at the forefront of or part of a team that were at the forefront of kind of leading the strategy, long-term strategy of the city, was really fascinating. I have to say my favourite board position is probably the one that I'm currently fulfilling, and that is as chairman of the Mandurah Performing Arts Centre. The Mandurah Performing Arts Centre is a dynamic organisation that's sort of recognised throughout Australia in the arts sector, and for its sort of innovation and interesting approach to audience engagement in the arts. And it's just such an honour to be part of an organisation that is so dynamic. And I think, being able to chair an organisation is something really special, because, essentially it gives you the chance to be able to really, get into that kind of strategic thinking and strategic implementation, and look at new ways of doing things, and all of those components without actually without having the responsibilities of the CEO. I mean, chairmans have big responsibilities, but in terms of that day-to-day role, it gives you the chance to sort of be outside of that a bit. And so it's a really, people who are interested or have the opportunity to kind of be involved in board director positions, I'd say grab onto it, because great for ourselves personally as board directors, but also really important to have fresh minds coming through organisations, I think.
Is that perhaps something that you think you contributed to the boards that you've been on? I guess especially some of the younger ones. You mentioned that with the first board that you served on, you thought perhaps you were their youth representative, I guess. Could you speak perhaps on I guess the pros and cons of being involved as in that kind of position, and what someone might do if they were also in that position?
So what I'd say is, I don't think that's a good reason not to do it. Like, lots of organisations are looking, and I'm like unashamedly call them token young people positions, because I think there's kind of this there's this feeling amongst some organisations that, geez, we better have a young person on the board. And I look, for whatever reason they decide to do that for, the reality is it's probably a good idea. So even if they're doing it because they're going to be writing a project plan for engaging young people, and they have to demonstrate that they've got the credibility on the board, or whatever the reason is, it doesn't matter. It's really important to have fresh minds at the board level.
Net positive effect, even if that's what they weren't intending.
That's exactly right. And when you look around at the significant changes that the entire world has gone through in the last decade, it just, for me, drives home that message of, look, it's not about, being young and having all the answers, and it's not about being young and inexperienced and having to stay quiet and not contribute. It's actually about recognizing that age doesn't necessarily mean anything, and that as, fresh minds coming into professional, professional times, we actually need to be able to kind of recognize that you have something to contribute, and to contribute. And again, it's like what I was saying about being a mentor. If you've got the ability, if you've got the capacity, then you kind of should do it.
Well, if someone were to find themselves in this position with perhaps not very much previous experience or knowledge of the role of a board, what would you suggest perhaps that they do to prepare themselves for this role, and how could they find out a bit more?
So I think get to know the organisation, and make sure that it's a passion for you. Like, it's really hard to, lots of board directors have got examples of this, where you're on a board and you've been asked to join, and you say yes because, you think, oh, well, that'll be, a good experience. And then you get there and you kind of think, okay, like, I'm not really passionate about this. I think that's a thing. So start looking for things that you're passionate about. Recognize that your contribution to that organisation has to be based on something that or at least plan. It might not necessarily have to be like this, but plan to contribute something to the board that you think others probably don't. So what's your niche? What's the thing that you can contribute? And, too often we talk about, oh, well, the young people can do social media, so that'll be great. But it's whatever. And it might be that, right? But it could be anything. So I think, start with a passion, recognize the thing that you can bring to it that's unique, and then start asking. And, there's so many boards out there that not only would like to be, but actually need to be refreshed. And so I would say no shortage. And again, I heard this summed up by someone once who said to me, geez, being on a non-profit board is like, it was a 4-year term for this person. And he said it was like 40 years worth of life experience in a 4-year term. And I thought, that's cool. Like that for me that's actually true.
Sounds like you had a similar experience yourself, really.
Absolutely. And look, so it's twofold, and we shouldn't pretend that it isn't. We can, as board directors, there's an opportunity to contribute a great deal. And I think if you go into it with the right headspace, then you will. But there's also the other component, which is you can actually get a lot out of it. And so it's a win-win, which is perfect.
Wonderful. Thanks very much for joining us on Sproutcast today, Rhys. I think your insights have been really invaluable, and it's wonderful to have someone speaking on more than one perspective of a non-profit organisation. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And if you haven't got your tickets, anyone that's listening, if you haven't got your tickets to the Sprout Summit yet, make sure you come along. It looks like it's going to be a great day.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rhys.
No worries. Cheers.
Did you enjoy this episode of Sproutcast? Visit sproutcast.net to sign up for our newsletter. The newsletter includes copies of the show notes and additional content from each episode.